F4F Wildcat was the first Grumman production aircraft to see widespread use in combat. Its main opponent, the A6M20, was superior in most aspects and initially dominated the skies over the Pacific, but by the end of 1942, American tactics, particularly the Thatch weave, combined with the ruggedness and reliability of their aircraft, meant the tables were turning. By the end of 1942, the Wildcat had a 6-to-1 kill-loss ratio. The first Grumman fighter project was the F4F biplane, which was developed into the F4F and F3F. Grumman's first monoplane fighter used a fuselage based on the F3F, becoming the F4F-2. After testing and evaluation, the Navy found Grumman's prototype to be generally inferior to the Brewster F2A Buffalo, a slightly slower but more agile monoplane fighter, which was chosen for production instead. However, Grumman didn't give up. They reworked their prototype from the ground up and created the XF4F3. With new wings, a new tail, and a more powerful Pratt & Whitney twin-wasp engine, this model proved to be markedly superior to the previous iteration, and entered production as the F4F3, the first of which was completed in February 1940. France ordered a number of F4Fs, but fell to Germany before the delivery was made. The order was instead sold to the Royal Navy, who named the aircraft the Martlet. The US Navy was officially equipped with the F4F in October 1941, naming it the Wildcat. The Wildcat was generally outperformed by the Mitsubishi Zero, its major opponent in the early part of the Pacific Theatre, but held its own partly because, with relatively heavy armour and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Grumman airframe could survive far more damage than its lightweight and armoured Japanese rival. Many US Navy fighter pilots also were saved by the Wildcat's ZB homing device, which allowed them to find their carriers in poor visibility, provided they could get within 30 miles range of the homing beacon. The Japanese ace Saburo Sakai described the Wildcat's capacity to absorb damage. He had full confidence in his ability to destroy the Grumman and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only his 7.7mm machine guns. He turned the 20mm cannon switch to the off position and closed in, but even after he had poured 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman, the airplane did not fall but kept on flying. Grumman's Wildcat production ceased in early 1943 to make way for the newer F6F Hellcat, but General Motors continued producing Wildcats for both US Navy and Fleet Air Arm use. At first, General Motors produced the FM1, identical to the F4F4, but with 4 guns. Production later switched to the improved FM2, optimized for small carrier operations with a more powerful engine, and a taller tail to cope with the increased torque. From 1943 onwards, Wildcats equipped with bomb racks were primarily assigned to escort carriers for use against submarines and attacking ground targets, though they would also continue to score kills against Japanese fighters, bombers, and kamikaze aircraft. Larger fighters such as the Hellcat and the Corsair and dedicated dive bombers were needed aboard fleet carriers, and the Wildcat's slower landing speed made it more suitable for shorter flight decks. The first version in War Thunder, the F4F3, is powered by the Pratt & Whitney R1830, developing 1200 horsepower, and is armed with 4 M2 Browning machine guns. The F4F3 made its combat debut on the 9th of December 1941, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Efficient tactics to counter the Zero hadn't been developed yet, and the pilots suffered heavy casualties at the hands of the Japanese, but the Americans put up a fierce defense, shooting down at least 1 Japanese aircraft. Later, the destroyer Kisaragi was sunk by Wildcats armed with bombs. In May 1942, the F4F3s on board Yorktown and Lexington participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington and Yorktown fought against the Zukaku, Shokaku, and the light carrier Shuho in this battle, in an attempt to hold a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby on Papa. A new version, the F4F4, entered service in 1942, armed with 6 machine guns and equipped with folding wings which allowed more aircraft to be stored on an aircraft carrier. The F4F4 was the definitive version that saw the most combat service in the early war years, including the Battle of Midway. The F4F3 was replaced by the F4F4 in around June 1942, roughly the time of the Battle of Midway. Firepower was increased from 4 machine guns to 6, but this was less popular with American pilots because the same amount of ammunition was spread across 2 additional guns, decreasing firing time. With the F4F3's 4 50 cals, pilots had 34 seconds of firing time. 6 guns decreased ammunition to 240 rounds per gun, which could be expended in less than 20 seconds. Extra guns and folding wings meant extra weight and reduced performance. Rate of climb was noticeably worse than the F4F3. Although new folding wings added weight, they allowed 2.5 times as many aircraft to fit on the carrier. Grumman stopped building the Wildcat in early '43 and instead began production of the F6F Hellcat, but General Motors continued producing Wildcats for both US Navy and Fleet Air Arm use, and it was used on escort carriers, which were unsuitable for larger aircraft, until the war's end.